The first thing I'd like to say about this piece is its genre is very special, and so is its background. We can't really talk about the great opera composer Benjamin Britten without mentioning his first smash success, which premiered in 1945 in London at Sadler's Wells. Some of you may know that London had for a few years before and including 1947 been embroiled in quite a traumatic international event known as the Second World War. And so in comes this opera, which is extraordinarily dark, violent, with music that was nothing like Gilbert and Sullivan or Edward Elgar. Very challenging, massively expensive, with a huge chorus, a huge orchestra, and a large cast that requires every member of it to be very, very skilled. And yet it was a smash success. People loved it. People flocked to it. However, as you may remember, not remember personally, but remember from reading, for several years after the end of the Second World War, London and all of England was plunged into an era of incredible austerity. We would all have difficulty, I think, living through it. And so Benjamin Britten himself looked around at the landscape and realized that this kind of grand opera that he'd just succeeded with was not really feasible. Not really feasible for many of the country's citizens to go to and see, and not really feasible for production companies to mount. And so he began writing pieces with very small casts, no chorus, and a tiny orchestras. So they could kind of pick up the slack. And also, they were designed so they could be successfully mounted with very little set. And that meant they could travel very easily from community to community and play in various church halls, etc. And that's what The Turn of the Screw is. We've done all of the three Paramount Britten chamber operas. Albert Herring, I don't know if anybody remembers that. That's a wonderful piece. And The Rape of Lucretia also. And this culminating masterpiece, The Turn of the Screw. So there's a little bit of background about it as well. And I want to begin with an address that Britten gave when he received an important award at Aspen. And he talked about what I guess we could call his philosophy, his purpose as a composer as he saw it. And it was really to provide music that was in some ways useful to his contemporaries, for whatever they found music to be useful. He did not want to write music that was destined for posterity and to outlive him, although he managed to do that. He did not want to write music that challenged the traditions of composition, although he did that as well. But he wanted to write music that his peers, not only composers, but the people who lived in the same cities and worked in the same areas, would appreciate and would find appealing, which I thought was a remarkable thing for a composer to say. There was no highfalutin ideas about the greatest art and this, that, or the other. He was just basically talking about how a workaday composer manages to do his job, or her job, or their job. And if it's going to be infused with genius, that's something beyond his control. So I found that extremely refreshing. And off he went to do these things. Now, in 1953, Britten had 2 successful chamber operas behind him and 2 successful what I would call grand operas. Peter Grimes was the first grand opera and Billy Budd the second. Has anybody had the opportunity to see either of those in person? Yeah, a few people have. So he was writing an opera in 1953 for the commemoration of the coronation of the late Queen Elizabeth II. Just think of it, 1953, she was crowned. She'd been queen for a year and she managed to remain queen until 2022. Anyway, he had based this grand work on stories having to do with Queen Elizabeth I. So it was a big undertaking, and he received a commission from Venice to produce an opera for their opera house, and it would be a chamber opera. Most composers would say, I don't have time, but Britten didn't do that. He said yes. And so this work would get its premiere in 1954 at a festival in Venice. And I've often wondered, well, I wondered when I saw it on Sunday, about these Venetian people sitting in this theater watching this without subtitles or without surtitles. How on earth did they know what was going on? Because this is a deeply ambiguous piece. But they did. And as somebody put it, in Italian operas, people come out there and they sing about what they're feeling and they sing about what they're thinking about. In English operas, they don't talk about what they're feeling about. You have to dig underneath to figure it out. And they also allude to events without too much specificity in their language. Never more so than in this work. Now, The Turn of the Screw, some of you will know because of the novella by Henry James, correct? I want to ask this question because I think other people may remember this. It was turned into a film called The Innocence that starred Deborah Kerr. I don't know if anybody saw that. It was good. It was a good film version. And of course, Britten had turned it into an opera. And the choice of this subject was given to him by a friend named Miffanwy Piper. She was the wife of a set designer that had worked with him quite frequently. And she thought it was a perfect subject for this particular person. That's already a little bit spooky. So I know this ghost story with no real answers to only the most ethereal questions, that's you. So anyway, he agreed and asked her to put together a kind of précis, a dramaturgical synopsis for him. And she created one that was so good, he said, why don't you write the whole text? And she had not had experience doing that, but not one, but two or three of the writers that I consulted, I read some things and they said, this is probably the finest libretto Britten ever set. And certainly it's flawless of its kind, and it's daring. And Britten and Miffanwy Piper had a number of consultations because there were some questions that had to be arisen. When I said it's ambiguous, it's more than that. There's ambiguity layered upon ambiguity, questions, more questions, no answers. And part of that comes from the translation of novel prose into opera, music and libretto. And one of the things to remember, does everybody know there are ghosts in this? Yeah, good. I'm not going to have too many spoilers, but you know, as I'm fond of saying, I can't remember who said it, but somebody once said, Pride and Prejudice, after all, it's only, all that happens is a girl changes her mind and a boy changes his manners. That's really what the whole novel's about. Plot is not an essential element when we're looking at opera or novels, or at least art. In any case, so I might divulge a few things. What we have in the novel, the ghosts never say anything. They never actually speak or exchange dialogue. And in the opera, they do. Both Piper and Britten felt they must. But they didn't want these ghosts going around going, ooh, like that, because it's just not, that wouldn't support a piece of drama that's meant to engross. So they had to choose what types of character that these ghosts would be. But I think the main question is, do they really exist? Throughout the opera, throughout our production at any rate, you will see that they appear to the governess. I'm going to go through a little bit of the plot. They will appear to the governess. They certainly appear real to the children, or at least they do in her perception of the children's reaction to them. But do they appear real? Are they ever seen by the house's maid or housekeeper? It's impossible to say. So that's probably the largest primary color ambiguity in the whole piece. And we're not meant to know. I don't think we even need to make up our own minds as to what we think about it. In any case, a little bit more about Britten's style, if I may introduce something of that musical. Excuse me. Britten lived at a time when he felt very much like an outsider. He felt marginalized and alienated from the basic run, the majority of English society. For any number of reasons. If you have a copy of the keynotes, you can get it back there. I did write a piece that talks about that in more detail, but we'll concentrate on how he felt like an outsider in music. He lived at a time when much British music was very folk-centered. He may quote a couple of folk songs in this piece, but composers like Ralph Vaughan Williams and Gerald Finzi were saturating their music with English pastoral style, not necessarily folk song, but music that sounded like folk song. And he did not want to be involved with that kind of music making. At the same time, there were avant-garde composers who were writing extremely out there, difficult to understand, alienating music. The 50s, after all, was the decade when many academic composers simply decided they didn't need to worry about audiences anymore at all. And he didn't want to have anything to do with that either. After all, he did say he writes music for his contemporaries. So he didn't really fit anywhere. His musical language is not alienating, but it does have a lot of dissonance. It may use folk-based themes. He was a lover of folk music, but it's not folk-saturated. It uses language from previous eras. He was a very deep scholar of music from the Renaissance, from the Baroque, and from the classical era. And there are elements of that in this piece, and all of those feature in Britten's operas. So at the same time, there's no sense ever of his music being a pastiche or an imitation of anybody. It is absolutely his own. So looking at this music and looking at the central premise of the whole piece, which is about the coexistence or the impossibility of coexistence of corruption and innocence, how they react to each other, it's interesting that he chose a technique that is associated with the more radical composers of the middle 20th century. I'm talking about 12-tone technique. Is anybody unfamiliar with that? Would you like a quick explanation? Okay, I'm going to give you one anyway. It's basically a response to a feeling that what had been done in tonal music had basically exhausted the potential of that. In other words, it can almost always be boiled down to this. Yeah. Are you all wanting me to finish? Yes. Or I could illustrate it with chords. We need that chord. Well, 12-tone music sought to obliterate that hierarchy and create a kind of language in which no note was more important than any other. All of the 12 notes that are contained within the chromatic scale. I'm going to play you a piece considered one of the great masterpieces of 12-tone music. And keep in mind, this is a technique that Britten borrowed in the very piece you're about to go and see and listen to for 2 hours. Did anyone hear the wrong note that I played? So that is the opening of a set of variations by Webern. And that is, it's music that is somewhat alienating, I think. That's from the 1930s, and it still has a following, albeit not a particularly large one. But the technique intrigued Britten, and so he created a series of motives that uses all 12 of those tones, but then he creates a language that takes them and then roots them in what we might call modal music and tonal music. Music we're used to, music we've been listening to since the Renaissance and the Baroque. So here are all the 12 tones in the order that, that Britten chooses. And as Joey Pietroia points out, he uses the notes that can be made into a scale going upwards and then coming downwards. Now we can actually really enjoy this opera without knowing any of this, but it's actually interesting to hear a couple of things. I'm going to play you now the passage where that tone row begins to find its way into the music. Where did it go? It doesn't sound as intimidating as the little piece by Webern, does it? You don't need to worry about not knowing also that it's organized into a theme and then 15 subsequent variations. And you don't need to know that the key structure actually illustrates the title of the piece, the turn of the screw, which refers to the extra turn of the screw in a medieval torture device known as the thumb screw. So I just told you all that, but now I'm going to say again, you don't need to know it. It's fascinating to analyze the piece and to read about it, but you don't need to know it to actually enjoy the piece. So a little bit more now about the characters, and then I'll play some of the music associated with them. I mentioned that the orchestra is very small for these chamber operas. It is. You can see a list of the Victoria Symphony players that are in it, and I will tell you this, they're all masterful players. They're in for an orchestral treat as well as a vocal and dramatic one. So we have the two children, I like to start at the very beginning. At the very beginning, we meet a character who does not have a name. He just is called the prologue. And we know that he is a man who has a nephew and a niece that do not any longer have living parents. And they're living in an estate in the countryside. Their governess has died, and the only adult there is a housekeeper. Now, given the size of the house as it's described, I don't think one housekeeper would be enough, but we don't need to bother ourselves with those things when we're talking about ghost stories. So there the children are, and the prologue will come out and talk about this, reveal this to us, and also reveal that a new governess has gone to talk to this man, a woman applying for the post of governess, and he talks about the children and about where they are and about the one important condition she is to remember, which is that he's a very busy man. He does not have time for them, and he does not want to be bothered. And what that means is she's not to come to London to see him, and she's not to even so much as send a letter, because obviously this predates telephones, let alone emails. And that is a very peculiar condition for the children's only living relative to impose, but he does. And she takes it very seriously. And the children's names are Miles and Flora. Miles has always been played by a treble, a boy soprano. And England, of course, in the 50s still had that glorious tradition of treble singing. And in those days, I don't know why, some people have explained it to me, but boys' voices often didn't break till they were 14 or 15, so they had a lot of power behind them. So Miles was played by a British actor, our future British actor named David Hemming. I don't know if anybody's heard of David Hemming before. And Flora was generally played by a professional adult singer. She's not in this piece, she's played by another child. So those are the two children. The housekeeper's name is Mrs. Gross. And into this comes a very nervous, unsure of herself governess whose name is never revealed at any point. So we have the uncle, the gentleman he's often referred to, and the governess. And she's very nervous because she has no idea whether the children will like her, but they do. And I'm going to play I'm going to play several pieces of music from this opera and just talk a little bit about what they represent. So one of the most important instruments in any of the chamber orchestras is the piano. And the piano functions as the accompanist during the passages of recitative, which are meant to be delivered by the singer with the rhythmic patterns of speech rather than the metrical patterns of dance. And this is when the prologue comes on and sets the story. Every now and again, there'll be a little bit of punctuation from pizzicato strings, but during that is when we hear the whole story. And then the prologue leaves, the man singing the prologue leaves. He won't come back again on stage as a prologue, but he will come back again on stage. Then there's one of these fantastic Britten things where the governess is depicted riding her horse and carriage. We don't have a horse and carriage, it's all very suggested. This principal flute you're going to hear to perfection tonight. And this is accompanied by percussion. Again, with occasional punctuative chords from the pizzicato strings. It'll sound something like this. But shall I love them as I love my own? And she sings on top of that. It's brilliantly evocative with the most economical means. So everything is set up. The children will sing two folk songs that are genuine folk songs that everybody will know. They're, in other words, quotations. Does everybody recognize this one? What's it called? Lavender's Blue. And Tom, Tom, the piper's son. So we have those two folk songs that'll percolate a couple of the scenes, but everything's looking very nice, looking so nice that the governess can relax. Now I'm going to say something that I think has to be understood. Not that I don't trust you to understand it without my giving you a little bit of gentle prodding, but I think the governess, like so many characters in the 19th century literature is somewhat repressed. And something stirs within her when she has this encounter with this strange gentleman who is the children's uncle, because she refers to him quite a lot in ways that suggest maybe she wishes he would come to the house and stay there and make some sort of proposal to her. So there's that undercurrent. She never says any such thing as what I've just said, but there's definitely a hint that, you know, she's excited. Anyway, she finally relaxes and she goes out into the garden and she watches and she looks and she gazes and she begins to feel at peace because it's so beautiful. Now here's where you have solo winds, flute, clarinet, oboe, and French horn playing. I think the bassoon is too. And you get this incredible amount of beautiful sounds. And it's accompanying, first of all, the scene itself, and then her own observations and soliloquy. It's just the most beautiful scene painting music. And then it's interrupted. I'm going to read this passage of text. It's interrupted because the governess sees a man, the figure of a man on a tower. And I'll talk a little bit about this, the music or the instrument that accompanies this figure. But she sees the man and she's terrified because she has no idea who he is, what he's doing there. And then she goes inside the house and she sees him looking inside the window at her. And at this point she feels she must tell Mrs. Gross. And she says about the man, his hair was red, which makes it a wonderful coincidence that we have Isaiah Bell playing the part, because he's got a full head of red hair. His hair was red, close curling, a long pale face, small eyes. His look was sharp, fixed and strange. He was tall, clean-shaven, yes, even handsome, but a horror. And at this point, the story begins to emerge of a previous valet to the uncle who has died, but whose influence on the household was malevolent and malignant. And he took advantage of everybody, including and perhaps especially young Miles. And also the children's former governess, Miss Jessel. So those are the next characters that you meet, and they are ghosts, they are people who have died. But immediately Mrs. Gross knows who the governess is talking about. And there's also a letter received from Miles's school. He spends no time at school in the opera because the opera, which is able to suggest the passage of time, brings into it very quickly a letter that has been sent from the school that Miles has been expelled. He's been released from school and the reasons are never made clear, they're suggested, which makes it more creepy. How many movies have you seen in which violence was only suggested or it happened off screen? And that's way more effective than seeing all that special effects stuff. So anyway, we know that Miles has done things which were hurtful to the other students, the other boys. We don't know what they were though. And so we will listen to him ruminate during a Latin lesson. It's basically a play on words that has to do with the conjugation of a single verb. I'll play you the melody, then I'll tell you the words. And he's saying, malo, malo, I would rather be in an apple tree than a naughty boy in adversity. And that brings us again to a subject which is central to the entire thing. Is Miles bad? He sometimes thinks he is. Other people have said he is, but is he really? And now we will meet Peter Quint and ultimately Miss Jessel. Act 1 ends basically with everybody on stage. And Peter Quint sings to the accompaniment of the celesta, which I think is deliberate irony. Miss Jessel gets a gong, and during moments of intense sadness, Miles gets a low-pitched flute. But Peter Quint, who is the valet's name, is given the celesta. Now, everybody knows the most famous piece for celesta, right? Now, it's a keyboard instrument that's meant to suggest the sound of bells. And it's so named because of the celestial sound of bells. Now, we'll hear some celestial bells played during the course of this piece. But there's nothing whatsoever celestial about Peter Grimes, and his music can almost sound like Islamic or Gregorian chanting, and it features melisma. Now, do you all know what a melisma is? Do you want me to explain it to you? If you've ever listened to Mariah Carey, you've heard melismas. It's when you sing a lot of notes on a single syllable, right? And Peter Quint has an extensive melisma as he begins. Of course, it's nighttime. Of course, Miles is sleeping. He begins to entreat Miles to come to him. So this is the celesta. This is Peter Quint's line. The celesta. And he's only saying Miles's name. And finally, Miles answers, "I'm here. Oh, I'm here." And throughout the course of this scene, we will see and experience the power that the vision of Peter Quint has upon young Miles, and also the power that Miss Jessel holds and exerts over young Flora. And the governess who sees them is consumed actually with horror at what she's witnessing. And at one point she actually refers to it, and you get a real treat. I mentioned the woodwinds and the percussion and the piano and the celesta. Now let's talk about the strings. The words are, "Lost in my labyrinth, I see no truth. Only in the foggy walls of evil press upon me. Lost is my labyrinth." And from the double bass through the cello, through the viola to the violins, you get this rapid music. In 1997, when we produced it, I could play this. So that's all played brilliantly by the members of the Victoria Symphony that are the principal string players. And so she's undergoing, I think, torment. And I'm not really conveying enough how on the surface things are seeming normal. In daylight things seem normal. And there's a wonderful scene where Miles sits at the piano and practices. And it couldn't be more classical sounding. It sounds like a Mozart sonata, except when it doesn't, these odd little bits of dissonance come creeping in. Mrs. Gross thinks they're creative and praises Miles, but the governess feels that there's something corrupt in these. So it's even infecting his practicing. And quick note, while he's practicing and being made a fuss of, being fussed over by Mrs. Gross and the governess, the two living adults, Flora is playing cat's cradle until she very silently leaves the room. Then he just plays like that. Well, it's Kimberly Bartzak playing it brilliantly in the piano in the pit. And we go out and find, when they're looking for Flora, that she's gone down to the lake all by herself, except Miss Jessel is there. And again, a very stirring scene takes place, and Mrs. Gross finally realizes that the things that the governess has been warning her about have happened. The children have been taken over by these ghosts, and she says, I must take Flora to her room. And the next morning, when the governess is awake, she's been trying to deal with Miles. Mrs. Gross comes in with Flora and a packed suitcase, and she says, the things that I have heard tonight coming in her dreams that she's been revealing to me, I can't think about, I don't want to think about, but I'm taking her away. She must leave. So they leave the house with the governess and Miles alone with the ghosts. And Peter Quint must have a final confrontation with the governess, who feels that she's fighting for the soul of Miles. Does she win? It's a hollow victory in many ways. You can figure that out. But Peter Quint does leave. That's all I'll tell you. I'm sure you all know how it ends anyway. The plot synopsis is in the program. I find it quite deeply unsettling. And I found that it was more deeply unsettling the more I thought about it after I saw it, which is my favorite kind of art. And I think that you'll really enjoy our production, from the lighting and design to the individual performances. They're deeply committed to bringing this piece to you in all of its authenticity. So I do hope you enjoy this new production of Britten's Turn of the Screw. Have a great evening. Thank you. Thank you.